This content is on ways to measure your dependent variable. So as you know from our last content, your dependent variable is the focus of your study. It's the most important thing. It's so important that you're operationalizing it and measuring it. So you think that whatever it is you're measuring depends on something you're going to do, so it's really important that you figure out what it is and how to measure it. So first you'll be naming and defining your dependent variable, and so giving it a nice clear name, and then making it very clear what you mean by that, because there can be different nuances to dependent variables, and for that reason it is best to use a definition that's consistent with other researchers' definitions of that variable. Verbatim, using the exact definition is even the best way to go. And then, of course, we talked about operationalizing your dependent variable, which is basically finding a way to measure your dependent variable. And like with naming and defining it, it's best to operationalize it in a way that other researchers have used. So hopefully you're looking these things up right now. So just examples of the dependent variable. In the Good Samaritan study, the dependent variable was helpfulness, measured through the extent that participants helped an injured stranger on the side of the road. And the stranger was what we call a Confederate. He wasn't really injured. In the car crash study, the dependent variable was accuracy, measured through individuals' estimates of car speeds in a video they had watched. And in the Bobo doll study, the dependent variable was aggression, measured by the extent to which children hit, punched, pushed, and behaved in other aggressive ways toward an inflatable doll. So in each case, these researchers thought that this dependent variable was very important, and that's why they chose to work with it and try and influence it through their manipulation. So there are a number of ways to measure your dependent variable. One of the first ways and the most obvious ways that we think about in psychology is through self-report measures. And what we mean by this is using scales completed by participants to measure their level of a dependent variable. So it's very commonly used, but it's problematic in some ways, because first off, we have a possible risk called social desirability bias. And that refers to producing answers to please the researcher. Valid, reliable scales have corrections in place to protect against social desirability bias, but it takes a long time to develop those scales and test them. An example of what we mean by this is you can see this person looking at this picture and thinking that picture is very ugly. But then her friend says, "This is my favorite picture. Do you like it?" And in a desire to please, this other person responds, "I love it." So she's responding dishonestly out of a desire to please. A second kind of bias is recall bias. Individuals may have forgotten exactly what occurred or how they felt. We all have distortions through our own perceptual filters, and then we also have flawed memories that can't remember the details exactly. And we know that if you and I witness the same event, we'll remember certain aspects of it quite differently, and we'll be kind of locked into our own interpretations. Thirdly, we have cultural bias. The questions in a scale or questionnaire may be biased toward a culture different from the researcher's culture. For example, if you devise a study and you have in your background a large knowledge of Navajo culture and tradition, and that is in some of your questions, like what was your experience during your first ceremony, then I wouldn't be able to answer that because I haven't had a ceremony. And so that would be an example of bias. So we have an example of a really nice scale. I can't link to it in this medium, but this is an example of a self-report scale that measures something called sensation seeking. Like, to what extent does an individual seek really exciting sound or taste or sights or smells or experiences or touch, but also just experiences in general like the skydiving. So it includes this, but also these other sensory sensation seeking. And it's an important scale. It's one that's been validated, which means they gave it to thousands and thousands of people, and they found that among all those people tended to converge on certain characteristics. And once we get a valid scale like this that's reliable, it can be used in research. For example, a researcher might ask, are people high in sensation seeking more likely to become addicted to stimulant drugs? So we have here a way that this scale could be used. If we find that people who are high in sensation seeking are more likely to become addicted, then maybe we can address that characteristic proactively before they become addicted. Another way to measure your dependent variable is observation. Observational measures means you're observing overt things that we can actually see. Behaviors, gestures, facial expressions of a person who may or may not be aware that they're being observed. So instead of asking you, are you feeling angry? We learn to detect what anger looks like in a person and systematically observe those cues and record those. And then we would have an objective observational measure. So we need to clearly define what we're measuring. And what this means is if we're measuring anger, the example I just gave, we have to have very precise descriptions of what it looks like. For example, color in certain areas of the face might be an example, or dilated pupils might be an example, or sweat breaking out on the brow, or a certain crease of the mouth. But we have to put exactly what we expect in a facial expression that's representing anger so that the observers know what they're observing. We have to train our observers then in our definition. So if we have determined what facial expressions of anger look like, then we have to train those who will be observing for us to recognize what those cues are and allow them to observe them consistently so that they are coding the behaviors in the same way that we are. And there's potential bias in the sense that if the observer knows the hypothesis, then maybe the observations might be biased in support of the hypothesis. So blinding is necessary, meaning that it's best if the people doing the observation don't know the hypothesis. And so, for example, naturalistic observation, this example of somebody observing chimpanzees in a real life environment and maybe observing emotions from the facial expression, even if they're that far. So that's naturalistic because it takes place in a natural environment. And within naturalistic observation, we could have participant observation or non-participant observation. And so participant observation might be this teacher may be taking systematic notes on what situations contribute to her students fighting. And so in that case, she would be part of the group because she's the teacher, and at the same time, she'd be stepping back and observing their behaviors. In non-participant observation, we have someone who is outside looking in and maybe recording what behaviors that person observes. So just some types of observation. One type of observation is done, and this is so this very famous task is called the strange situation, and it was developed by a researcher, Mary Ainsworth, to identify attachment style of infants from actually about age of 1 to 2. And the attachment style just means how closely linked they are to their parents in a healthy way. So how trusting are they of their parents and how much do they feel they can depend on their parents? And so these behaviors were coded through this particular task involving the mother and child going into a room filled with toys and having various configurations of a stranger entering and the child being alone with a stranger who is a safe person, a researcher, but a stranger to the child, and observing the child's behaviors. And the observation took place through this observation window, which was a two-way mirror, and also cameras were in place to document it further. So there was real-time observation and then also camera observation of this 4-minute activity with the child. And this is what the situation was set up like. And so this was observation. And I know my daughter participated in a study like this where they were looking at mothers who were imprisoned and whether their child's attachment to them was impacted. And so after the woman was released, if her child was within this age category, they would invite them to participate in the strange situation, and they would document the behavior. But in order to be one of these observers, my daughter had to take a very, very long training where she was taught all of the coding of these infants' behaviors, like what facial expression exactly are we going to mark as upset? You know, does it have to have tears? Are there certain other indicators, physical, that we can look at? And then she had to work with the other undergraduate students who were doing the same thing, and together they would code and make sure that their answers aligned with each other. So that's another type of observation. The people knew that they were being observed, so it was not covert, it was overt observation, but nevertheless it was behind a window so that their presence wouldn't impact what happened in the room. Another way to measure your dependent variable is through proxy measures. So you would be measuring your dependent variable in a subtle way, like non-direct. The person wouldn't know that you were measuring something when you were actually measuring it. And this would supplement self-report or replace self-report. And it's helpful in situations where people might not be able to report their own behavior. For example, how angry you're feeling or how aggressively you're likely to act. We can't ask people about that because they might not know or they might not be honest. So we look for other ways of measuring, say, aggression. And often it is behavioral. We're looking at the proxy measure as a behavior that represents the variable of interest. And here are some examples of proxy measures. So imagine we have this hypothesis. People who believe they will be loved later in life will be more helpful to a stranger than those who believe they will be alone later in life. So the dependent variable you can see is helpfulness. And it was measured unobtrusively by having a stranger drop a stack of papers just as the subject is exiting the room. And they measured the extent to which the subject, the person who either believed they were loved or not loved later in life, to the extent in which they would help that person pick up the papers. So that person wouldn't realize that that was what the researchers were looking at because it would have seemed like just an arbitrary experience, but in fact, it was their way of measuring helpfulness. A second hypothesis, people who have been primed with old age cues will walk more slowly than people who have been primed with youth cues. So in this case, the dependent variable is walking speed, and it's measured by the number of seconds it took each individual to walk from the lab room to a second room down the hallway. They had tape on the floor so that they would be able to start the timer exactly when that person's foot crossed over that tape. Thirdly, people who have been rejected will behave more aggressively than people who have not been rejected. And this is the example we had on the previous slide. And in this case, it was measured by the length and duration, by the volume and duration of a sound blast emitted to an opponent in a different location. And so these people were engaged in activity that was hypothesized to make them feel angry, that is, being rejected. And then when they had an opportunity to interact with another person, well, how aggressive were they? How loud and how long did they blast the sound to that opponent? So proxy measures. We then come to unobtrusive measures, and we might say that proxy measures are a type of unobtrusive measure. So it's measuring, going up to this right-hand corner, it's measuring your dependent variable in a secret way on topics where self-report may not be accurate. And again, it's helpful in situations where people can't or won't report their behavior honestly. And often we're looking for physical evidence as indicators of the behavior. This example says counting alcohol bottles in the trash to determine alcohol use, instead of just asking people how much alcohol do you use, or in addition to asking people. And so it's kind of a little bit It's sneaky, you might say, a little bit. Another one that might feel less bothersome to you is this example in a museum. If they want to know the popularity of various pictures, they would actually look at how fast the floor tiles are wearing out in front of different pictures. And so the more people are hovering or milling around a particular picture, the more the floor tiles will wear out. And so once again, they're using an unobtrusive measure to figure out picture popularity. Another example that I did not list is an example in which they went into people's offices or dorm rooms and looked at various indicators to see if they could detect personality traits just by looking at the room. So to what extent does personality manifest in the way a person keeps their physical surroundings? So slightly different from our proxy measures we were using, but in some ways similar, because the individuals don't know what's being measured. These do have the potential ethical problem that people may feel spied upon, and so we'll get to ethics coming up in a week or in 2 weeks. Physiological measures are really coming up, and this is measuring like a physiological or biological body process to understand a psychological phenomenon. So I have a bunch of examples here. So skin conductance, this down here is measuring the electrical signal in your skin, and perspiration as a measure of anxiety. They used to think this related to lie detection if you were lying, and that's not found to be valid. Eye tracking. Having a device, I don't have an image for it, that tracks your eyes. It's like pointing a camera at your eyes and tracking what they're looking at as a measure of interest. Heart rate variability, that is how well your heart rate increases and decreases in response to stimuli, is a measure of adaptiveness to stress. If you don't handle stress well, your heart won't fluctuate as it needs to in response to stressors. EEG data, or having these sensors that measure the electrical signal under the skin, under the scalp, as a measure of depression. And they found that left frontal lobe will be less active in people who are depressed. MRI brain data can measure activation in particular regions linked to emotion or cognition. So we can see in the brain whether a person is experiencing a particular emotion. And saliva swabs to measure cortisol levels. We can actually measure cortisol, which is a stress hormone, just through gathering your saliva. So once again, that's a really nice kind of tool to have access to. So the challenges are all of these things need special equipment and training. But however, our smartphones offer a lot of potential for this. And so if you are interested in a physiological measure, it may well be that people could be asked to use their smartphone data to get that for your dependent variable. So this question often comes up, and this is where we'll end. So let's say your dependent variable, you're thinking, I'll just write some questions. It's not recommended that you do it. First, it's time-consuming and labor-intensive and expensive to develop a valid, reliable measure. You have to get thousands of participants. Second, it's likely that someone else has already developed a valid measure of your construct of interest. Someone else already did this work. And if their scale measures the phenomenon or experience that you're interested in, use their tool. Thirdly, if you use an existing measure, then your research can combine with other researchers who use that same tool to draw a bigger conclusion, and that benefits all of the scientific world. So I will not encourage you to develop your own scale or questionnaire unless that is entirely the focus of your research study. So I want you to, right now, you could take your dependent variable, you could just go onto Google, start right there, and type in the name of your variable that you want to measure, and type in measurement or scale, something like that, and just see if there's something already existing that you can find even just on Google. So, and from there you'd have to go in to get the original study, the validation study to cite, but at least that's a starting point for you. So that is what I have for you in this content. I hope you found it helpful. It corresponds to content in Chapter 3 in the Adams text.